Talkback with Bharati Jagdish and Daniel Martin on 938 Live.
Welcome to the second edition of Talkback Town Hall, a special series where our ministers will answer your questions on policy issues. They will also be sharing the thinking behind the policies every Wednesday for the next few weeks. Our guest this morning is Minister of State for Manpower, ChuanJin. Today we will focus on nurturing every Singaporean in the workplace for better jobs and better lives. Now, during the budget debate in Parliament earlier this year, Mr. Tan spoke about developing the Singaporean core in our workforce. Some members of Parliament also expressed concerns about the challenges facing the professionals, managers, executives or PMEs. With improving education in terms of the profile of Singaporeans, this segment of PMEs is growing. 2 in 5 Singapore citizens have diplomas and above, compared to about 3 in 10 in 2001. 1 in 4 employed citizens in 2010 are armed with degrees, compared to 14% degree holders only in 2001. Today, 33% of all jobs are at the PME level. In 2011, there were about 629,000 resident PMEs. The employment rate is up slightly in the first quarter of 2012, according to MOM's labour market report released last week. Mr. Tan, first of all, welcome to the studio. I would like to say that you also singled out long-term unemployment among older workers as a concern. So what really are the government's plans to help Singaporean workers stay employed and employable?
I guess our strategy really revolves around 3 main prongs. Firstly, what is probably most critical is to create jobs. So jobs creation is essential. Clearly, all of us, when we graduate, after school, we all look for something to do in terms of occupation and so on. But we do need to create the conditions that's appropriate for job creation to take place. Just came back from Europe, where really at the moment they're gripped in a crisis and jobs are not always readily available. Unemployment is high in many countries, even Germany, where I was at, which is really the main driver in Europe, has 7% unemployment. So jobs creating is something that we continue to monitor. Secondly, it's also important to make sure that jobs matching takes place. So how do we help to facilitate the process? Individuals, of course, would be looking for jobs that will meet their requirements and so on. But I think that's an area where we can play quite an important role as well to supplement private arrangements. And lastly, I think in terms of job skilling, how do we help to keep our workers continually relevantly skilled to be ready for the job market? For example, the long cycle really is in terms of the education system, where we provide a foundation, and thereafter the short cycle really is in terms of continuing education and training, and how do you make sure that workers, actually at every age, continue to remain relevant. Because industries change, there are changing job requirements, and training, I think, would help workers keep relevant, even at the PME level.
Has Singapore done well in terms of its employment rates or unemployment rates and jobs matching and jobs creation? I
actually do believe that we are in a fairly strong position. We have had good economic growth. We weathered the last economic recession in 2008 fairly well. As I said earlier, coming back from Europe and looking at the situation there, in comparison, we are in a strong position. However, it's important to also look at it from the perspective that it's not really about statistics and data. While countries like, for example, Germany has 7% unemployment, in Singapore we have 3.2% unemployment for citizens. From my perspective, and certainly from my colleagues' perspective, we don't look at it as just a percentage. By all counts, these are very strong and low unemployment numbers, but it represents about 50 over 1,000 Singaporeans, and not just individuals, but it affects their families as well. So it's important for us to always remember that there is a person behind every statistic and a family that's affected. So that's why we continue to make sure that we monitor the situation. We continue to make sure that jobs get created, and that's really quite critical, because jobs can flow out of the country, to make sure that they continue to be skilled and relevantly skilled, and to make sure that we help them match them to jobs so that they can stay as employable as possible.
Now, even as companies are facing a softening labour market, with an easing of that manpower shortage and with vacancies falling, some employers are still complaining that they can't get local workers. So how do you propose we can resolve this dilemma facing the labour market?
This is an inherent tension, obviously faced by, I think, both policymakers as well as companies, as well as people at large. Firstly, we do realize that in Singapore, you do have finite limits. From a physical, infrastructural perspective, from a social perspective, we can continue to grow, but there are limits to that. And we cannot have an unlimited growth in terms of foreign worker numbers at all levels, both at worker and PME levels. So we are taking steps to actively manage that growth. And this is important because, firstly, purely from a physical standpoint, we need to manage that. Secondly, we also see that this is one way of moving our companies towards much more productivity-led growth rather than just an injection of labor. So this is an adjustment that companies would have to make. But at the same time, we do provide incentives to help companies to increase their productivity, to bring in more mechanization, to bring in more IT. But at the same time, we are also encouraging workers to come back to the workforce in terms of facilitating the work arrangements, encouraging flexi work arrangements. We are also trying to make sure that we help the matching process. There are Singaporeans who, despite the low unemployment numbers, are finding it difficult to find the relevant jobs. There are companies, SMEs for example, who find it difficult to find Singaporeans. So how do we try to match that as much as possible? So increasing the local workforce in terms of job participation, in terms of job matching, and for those who may need to readjust to different industries, in terms of job reskilling as well, those would be the steps that would have to take place. But companies need to take the step to restructure, to realign themselves going forward, where the growth in terms of foreign labor, for example, will be managed in a much more tighter fashion.
There are programs in place to help PMEs find where they need to go as well. I mean, specifically, there are things known as Calibre Link and Max Talent as well. Calibre Link is a service for professionals, managers, and executives set up by WDA, and that's something that will really help people in terms of online learning gateways, employment exchange, one-top exchange, things like that. How are programs such as these going to really be practically used by the PMEs whom they need to be used by?
Well, one of the things that Calibre Link does, as with many job placement agencies, is really to create a network. It's a new setup. It is growing. There are encouraging results. What they do is to link up with companies to establish a network that's available, and then they're able to then match that network to the people who are coming in to look for employment. Secondly, it's also to help people prepare themselves for the job market again. Sometimes we may be working for a long time, and then when we're looking at changing professions or moving to a new job, we might have forgotten some of the skills required to readjust ourselves, to conduct interviews, to prepare resumes, simple things like that, which has made a difference for a number of Singaporeans who have come forward. So there are a range of things that needs to be done, but the key thing is that individuals also do need to play a part. They need to also actively look out for jobs that are available to prepare themselves mentally, and I think also to realign themselves in terms of adjusting to a new work environment. So what WDA does via Calibre Link, or even programs like Max Talent, where we work closely with SMEs to match jobs to people, is that both parties need to play a very interactive role to put in as much effort as possible, and we try to match that as best as we can.
Now, Mr. Tan, you mentioned several very key things earlier. Singapore is restructuring towards productivity-led growth. The government is tightening the inflow of foreign workers. Companies are facing the challenges of lower foreign worker quotas, higher levies. We've spoken to several SMEs in the services sector as well, who say they may have to turn business away as they find it difficult to recruit locals or even automate much of their work. A lot of productivity experts talking about automation as well. Some are also thinking of relocating to lower-cost locations in the region. To what extent will this affect us in Singapore in a big way, the Singaporean worker?
We do want our companies to succeed. It's important. Companies provide jobs. When companies do well, they provide more jobs. Good companies provide good jobs. And that's necessary for the local workforce. Singapore is a small country. We do have a very small domestic workforce. We do need to depend on foreign workers, foreign talent as well. And as highlighted by many companies, they do face a tension in terms of sometimes looking for specific skills which may not be available, both in terms of skill set or perhaps just in terms of numbers. So we need to facilitate that. And certainly as we go forward, this remains important to us. But as mentioned earlier, we do also have physical limits. What it means is that we need to manage that growth. Companies will need to manage their own growth. It would mean that in certain cases, companies would have growth opportunities which they may find difficult to fulfill. Some companies, it may make sense to actually relocate. But relocation would also mean that some jobs would go. Certain jobs for Singaporeans would also have to go. This is inevitable in the process of restructuring. Certain jobs, it might be better off for companies to carry it out elsewhere. But certainly we try to help the companies as much as possible to keep companies here. Because even as they generate jobs, even as we provide jobs that foreigners would have to do, they are at the same time creating jobs for Singaporeans. Not only just directly, but the whole host of businesses that support those industries are also creating jobs for Singaporeans. And therein lies the tension between ensuring that growth remains, because growth creates jobs, at the same time managing the tensions in terms of the physical limits that we actually face.
Well, we're being joined right now by Joshua.
I'm pretty frustrated at the current situation of employing Singaporeans now. I mean, it's not that they are choosy. You know, right now the situation is such that a lot of Singaporeans have upgraded themselves and moved on to another job level, another hierarchy in this structure. But for me, we need lower skilled workers to do hard labor work like installation or even delivery sort of work. But it's quite hard to find these workers, and I'm lucky enough to be in a family business, and me and a few of my friends, we share this view because no one wants to do this work that is termed as in a lower skilled category.
So what have you had to do as an employer?
I did raise the salary level, and to be frank, it doesn't help because in terms of changing job, I can't afford to hire 7 Singaporeans a year to do that job, which is what is happening at almost every year. I go through a lot of local staff because I realize it's hard work. But then again, when you're stuck in a situation that you are in that category, what do you do? You know, I do work 6 full days a week, and we do 7-day weeks sometimes when there are projects.
You can't afford to hire 7 Singaporeans to do that job. So your preference, of course, would be to hire foreign workers. Is that right?
No, as in I cannot afford to change for that single job vacancies. I have to change 7
7 times, right?
Not that I want to change, but they had to resign because of various reasons, like it's too hard, too tough, long hours, and all that. How do I solve that question?
Let's put that to Mr. Tan.
There are a couple of issues here. One, I think, as we mentioned, and as you had mentioned, you have increased the wage levels. That's something that would be an immediate solution. The question is actually how high would wages go? For example, when I just came back from Europe, these are developed countries, and in many of the rank and file jobs, the pay is actually quite high. And that actually draws in people to take up employment in specific roles where perhaps today Singaporeans may not be prepared to do, but if the wages are high enough, there might be Singaporeans who would be prepared to step forward.
Is there something we have to consider, perhaps?
That's something I think we do need to consider. Certainly, we do know for low-income workers in some of these lower-skilled jobs, the pay is quite low. But I think wages can go up, but what it means is that increase the cost of doing business. So from a business perspective, I fully understand that actually that's difficult, especially when we come from a stage where we do have access to fairly affordable, say, foreign labor. But as you tighten the job market, what it means is that you might need to raise wages, and that has an impact on your bottom line.
What do you think it is going to take for us to make it a norm to hire locals for these jobs at these higher wage levels?
The consumers would need to be prepared to pay higher costs, both in terms of purchasing services. Clearly, in some cases where wages are low, as wages go up, services, the cost of services will have to go up. That's part and parcel of a developing economy where we have a maturing labor market and where we do see wages going up. At the same time, a lot of it is in terms of how we're able to match. We do know that there are Singaporeans. I mean, we do see Singaporeans who have a slightly lower education level, lower skill, but they are also looking for jobs in the relevant sectors. So how do we try to match that with companies who need that? I think some level of job matching will help. It may not solve all the problems, but I think that would be one way to do it. But in any case, it is not as if we are at the moment closing off the tap in terms of foreign workers altogether. Foreigners being in our workforce remain. What we're managing is the growth numbers. Obviously, there will be, as a result of businesses doing well, competition for those finite number of foreigners who are here. At the same time, because of the dependency ratios, we do require companies to hire a certain number of Singaporeans before they're eligible to hire a number of foreigners. And that's, I think, the correct policy, because we do want to encourage local companies to employ Singaporeans and not just exclusively go for an easier option.
We have Mr. Lee joining us now.
I feel that the government has done something right in the past 1 year in favoring a bit more on Singaporeans. But I think that even more needs to be done. For example, companies cannot have free discretion, like no quota on employment pass. I don't think the tripartite alliance that encourage fair employment for Singaporean works, because I think you must have a law that mandate that you have to hire Singaporeans first. If all else fail, then you hire foreigner. Because from my own personal experience, I met some U.S. company, multinational. They sell office in Singapore. But I can tell you that top management, not the top management, I think they hire around 20 people. Then out of these 20 people, like easily 16 of them, all of them are high-paying jobs. All of them are from a certain Asian country. That means you get someone, they will just hire their own villagers, kampong people to join the company. And I don't think they are even trying to hire Singaporeans. And the fact that their technical skill is not even as good, because during the meeting they have to get their US head office to explain to us how the things work. So this is what I mean by it's not working.
All right, let's put this to Mr. Tan.
This is also a common feedback that we do receive. We have actually tightened up the employment pass requirements. We have upped the educational and professional qualifications quite significantly. At the same time, we have also readjusted the wage levels at which we expect people to qualify for employment pass. Your issue or your perspective in terms of needing to restrict and to make sure we employ Singaporeans first before foreigners, it's a common refrain. But as I mentioned earlier, jobs creation is really quite critical for us. And a lot of companies, foreign companies, invest here because they have access to an open and diverse workforce. And that's a big attraction for companies being here. And that actually creates jobs for Singaporeans. And that's part of the tension that we need to manage in terms of making sure that Singaporeans remain employed, but at the same time addressing concerns such as the ones that you've described earlier.
So let's speak with Andrew right now.
I understand we need to do balancing of workforces within Singapore, but the last session I had calling in was that I put an advertisement out for jobs in my company. I got about 200 responses, and of the 200, I have 5 Singaporeans. Now, how do I balance that? I mean, I'm trying my best, and I think a lot of companies are trying their best. And I think the part of the Ministry of Manpower needs to look at is actually balancing the PMEs versus I call the ground level workers.
That's a situation that we face when we have a tight labor market. Companies are doing well. I'm sure your company is doing well. You're hiring, you have job opportunities, but you're fed back that you put up job advertisements and actually very few Singaporeans respond. Like I mentioned earlier, we do know that there are also Singaporeans in the same sectors, for example, who are actively looking for jobs. So this is something where we need to work closely, for example, with Max Talent, where we are working closely with SMEs to see how best to match workers and the needs of the companies. Secondly, we are trying to take more active steps to bring workers back into the workforce. There are a lot of women who are staying at home who are looking at rejoining the workforce. So upskilling them, reskilling them, and bring them back on the job market. That's a source of local workers that we are looking at to come back. Flexible work arrangements is another thing. Perhaps in certain jobs, I'm not sure about your particular sector. For example, in the F&B industry, in a lot of developed countries, they do make use of a lot of part-time workers, which actually allows us to open up the whole workforce quite considerably, because there will be people who are looking at part-time work, so at peak hours where they come in to provide services in the F&B industry and then come back later in the evening and so on. So that's something we need to encourage, and we do look at companies trying to restructure and rearrange the way they do business so that they can harness some of these people who are out there in the workforce to come in. But at the same time, I think we also realize that companies also need to look at, if there is a tight labor market and it's not easily accessible, then how do you then continue to grow without necessarily the easy inflow of foreign labor? As I mentioned earlier, we do understand that concern, but at the same time, from a macro perspective, there are physical limits. We can't continue to grow in a very open fashion.
Some of the things you mentioned, like changing the employment practices in terms of creating part-time labor opportunities, does that mean that the employer has to take the lead in some of these structural changes, or do they take the lead from involvement from authorities and figures like some of the programs you mentioned?
No, I think a lot for the employers themselves, the companies, they do need to look at the way businesses, how they conduct business. We have taken a look, for example, in specific industries and how it has restructured and how it's evolved. For example, in Japan, where they have less access to foreign labor, or in a lot of the developed countries in Europe and so on. And part-time work, for example, like I mentioned, the F&B industry is actually very common. It's less common in Singapore, but that's something that we see companies could look at evolving in that direction. And that's something that we will be quite keen, for example, through Spring, to work with companies to realign the work processes. And one of the big factors we find is that because of access to labor, many companies are not investing in IT, in other productivity measures. We do believe that there is actually still scope in a number of industries to move along those lines.
Now, the question really is, while companies say they want to hire Singaporeans first, not all Singaporeans are willing to be hired first in many of these industries, as we've heard from many of our listeners today. What can we do in terms of rebranding some of these jobs? Some experts have suggested that is what we really need right now.
That's actually a very relevant point. In many of my dialogues with SMEs particularly, we did talk about the need to rebrand and to refresh the image of some jobs. Many of these jobs that some Singaporeans may seem to shun actually are very respectable jobs. In many developed economies, well-educated, skilled Singaporean people in those countries actually do take up those jobs. So a big part of it lies with wages, wage levels. That's a form of signaling, an important one. But as you mentioned correctly, the image, the environment, the nature of the job, I think companies together with the relevant business associations can look at putting in more effort to rebrand, to realign people's expectations of some of these jobs. Sometimes it's because of face issues or impressions about certain professions, but we can actually up the image of some of these professions. Certainly that's what's happened in a lot of
How do you
countries.
think it can be done specifically? Let's talk about the job of a cleaner, for instance.
Well, I think business federations, business associations can play a very important role in looking at rebranding and uplifting the image of many jobs. Certain jobs I think will be difficult. For example, for cleaners, for example, I think no matter how we do it, there will be a number of Singaporeans who may be reluctant to take up that specific jobs. But even for the cleaning industry, for example, when I spoke to Minister Lim Swee Say, one of the ideas that he had and which he had put in place a number of years ago was actually even to simple things. For example, cleaners in the kopitiams and so on, actually give them proper uniforms, give them the proper utensils and professionalizing it in terms of image. So it becomes respectable even for people who are perhaps less educated, less skilled, but there is less aversion to taking up those jobs. And that's something that's quite doable, but it's something that companies need to do it. And especially for the associations themselves to band together to think about how do you uplift that image. And as you also change the work environment, change the wage levels, I think a combination of these factors would be able to play an important role in drawing Singaporeans into some of these sectors.
Speaking of what employers can do, we've got Lynn who's standing by right now.
Employers and employees must take ownership of the issue and cannot look to the government for all the solutions. I think, sharing my experience as an employer, what we have done is to really sit down as a company, a small company, and discuss what the issues are. And what, for example, we recently implemented this scheme where new employees must come on board on a contract basis for 6 months, and if they break the contract within 6 months, they actually must pay a penalty. So they come in with their eyes wide open, knowing that there's this penalty involved, and they take on a commitment to at least commit 6 months. During the 6-month process, they then make a decision whether they really want the job. So that helped actually to solve our problem, which we faced for many years, what an earlier caller shared, that people come and they leave within, a month or two. And that actually helped to solve our problem. So we say that employers need to keep trying together with the workforce and find different solutions, and you will find a solution that will fit the situation.
Let's go to Mona now.
I'm glad you have seen the situation in Europe, Minister ChuanJin, and you have concurred earlier on that for lower rank workers, raising their wages swiftly is the short-term immediate solution. That's good. And I think a concomitant problem that needs fixing is what you have pointed out correctly, instilling respect for those jobs. Why are people shunning those jobs? In Japan, for example, the cleaners are proud to be cleaners. How do we shake that culture from Japan to Singapore? And I was in Brisbane, Australia. The taxi driver that drove me around also doubled up as a reliable guide as he passed by various locations. So I think we really seriously need to break this cycle to give respect for vocations.
Minister Tan, what do you think about this idea of mindset change? That's probably one of the most challenging things to do, I feel.
Indeed, mindset change is quite difficult to bring about. But as pointed out by Mona, and as observed by actually many people who, for example, go to Japan, and in fact, actually many developed countries, people do take a lot of pride in what they do. And to be fair, Singaporeans do take a lot of pride in their work, in their respective areas of work. What we do need to do, as I mentioned earlier, really is to work closely with the business associations in sectors where we think that these are respectable jobs. Singaporeans can take up these jobs. We do need to look at realigning the public image, and that's something that can come through advertisements, can come through the way they repackage and professionalizing the jobs. And that's something that we're quite happy to support. I've mentioned to many of the business associations and federations, we'll be quite happy to work closely with them to promote some of these sectors. And as mentioned earlier by Lynn, there are actually many companies who have come up with creative solutions. They have taken on board the adjustments. They do recognize the constraints, but there are actually many good practices. We receive feedback from companies in the same sectors. Some have embraced the changes and actually have moved on and adapted to it. Others have not. And this is again where we believe business associations and federations can encourage a sharing of best practices, where companies who have done well to adjust to a tighter job market can actually share some of the best practices with other companies. But of course, we also are aware that companies are competing with each other, so perhaps the sharing of best practices may not be so easily
so
available.
Openly done.
Yeah, but it's something we do encourage, and I think that we have seen positive examples of this taking place as well.
Let's go to our Facebook page now. We have Yong Yong who's left this comment. The government has always encouraged the younger population, the younger workforce to join SMEs and to get their hands dirty and to learn the trade. In view of that, it's harder for these SMEs to attract talent, and young graduates prefer to join MNCs and even the public sector. However, at the same time, the government is also keen to look at recruiting and attracting these young people, especially the best and the brightest, to join the admin service. How would the entire equation, Yong Yong asks, balance itself out within the next 20 to 25 years? It seems to be that this is a zero-sum equation. Your response to that, Mr. Tan?
Well, thank you to Yong Yong for the question. It's not really a zero-sum game. For example, when you cited the government is also looking at people joining, say, the admin service. It's actually a very small service. The numbers concerned actually pale into comparison when you look at the numbers of people that are being employed by the SMEs. We do encourage young Singaporeans, or Singaporeans in general, to support the SMEs. SMEs are important to the industry, are important to the economy. They employ about 60% of Singaporeans. We do find that sometimes people tend to favor bigger companies, MNCs, or even joining the government service. So, which is why we are working very closely with the SMEs. For example, programs like Max Talent to match people who are looking for jobs, as well as the SMEs, providing incentives for SMEs to provide more training opportunities as well. And that's something that even with the SMEs we've talked about. Earlier we mentioned about image, we talk about professionalizing some of the jobs. That's something that SMEs can do as well, and we are also working closely with SMEs to up that image. The numbers actually don't lend itself to a zero-sum game, largely because the people who, for example, when you mentioned the admin service, they're very small numbers. There are many other Singaporeans who actually can continue to join the job market. But maybe I would like to move away from just talking about the young workers. Indeed, young workers coming online are important, but at the same time, older workers are also important. We have an aging population. A lot of Singaporeans are living longer, are staying healthier, are able to continue to contribute very effectively in the job market, whether for SMEs or bigger companies. And that's where I believe that we also need to look beyond just younger workers, but actually older, matured workers who bring with them a lot of stability, a lot of experience, and they can also play a very important role for SMEs themselves. So I think we need to broaden our search and not just look at the younger segment, but really Singaporeans of all ages.